Hello, I'm Somi Arian. I'm a tech philosopher, author, filmmaker, and the founder of FemPeak. On this podcast, I speak to some of the most brilliant minds of our time to help us navigate emerging technologies leading to a socioeconomic singularity. Our guest on today's podcast is Stephan Livera, the host of a leading Bitcoin podcast. He's also the managing director of Swan Bitcoin International. One of the most fascinating things about these conversations is that I'm learning how much the perspectives of various industry leaders can be different from each other. From the outside, most people think of the crypto space as being one thing. But for example, Stephan and I have very different views. I think blockchain is really a game changer as a technology that is empowering many other sociocultural movements. But Stephan is less interested in such technologies as Ethereum, NFTs, DAOs, etc. It's definitely a fascinating topic, and I really hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. It's so important to hear different perspectives and decide for yourself what you think is the right way to approach this space. Before we start, let me tell you a few words about our sponsor for today's show. Metaverse Society, founded by Holger Manwiller, is the first project that builds a utility bridge between NFTs and the metaverse and a legacy industry. Every Metaverse Society NFT grants its holder unseen IRL utility of up to 300 cans of free craft beer per year in perpetuity, voting rights on the business decisions, and access to exclusive brewing classes and beer tastings. First of all, thank you for being here. It's not every day that I get a chance to talk about these topics. Of course, I'm running a platform where we teach people about Web3 and, everything to do with tokenization, how tokenization is changing the society. I'm trying to explain to them that this is really about how, as humans, we are organizing ourselves. So the bigger picture. So for many people, topics like Bitcoin is just about number go up. And I try to explain to them that this is much bigger than it's about how we as humans are learning a new way of organizing ourselves. So maybe to begin with, you got some strong views on in terms of your political philosophy. I think, listening to a lot of the conversations that you've had, I pretty much put myself in a similar camp to you. I think I'm an anarchist at heart. I think I do believe that we as humans can eventually, using technology, find ways to organize ourselves that doesn't require a centralized government. I come from Iran originally, so you can imagine that I have a bit of a disdain for, for authoritarianism, and it does worry me now that I live in the UK that sometimes I see signs of authoritarianism even in Western governments. So why don't you start by explaining about your stance and the different camps within this different stages of how far away you go from the government.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So broadly speaking, yes, I subscribe to the libertarian school of thought, if you will. So that is a political school of thought or political philosophy generally focused on the rights of the individual and on private property rights. Now, within the world of libertarianism, there are different camps or schools of thought under that broad banner of libertarianism. There are those who believe in, let's say, a smaller government than what exists today, and they might call themselves libertarians. And then there would be what we term minarchists. These are people who believe in, let's say, the minimal form of the state. And so from that point of view, it's generally things like police and courts and the very minimal aspect. And then over on the fully free market side, let's say, is the anarcho-capitalist view of libertarianism, which is that everything should be private, even the law, even the enforcement, even the jailing, even the roads, even the national defense, quote unquote national defense. All of these things could be privatized and would be done better by the private sector than by the state. And so important to note here that from a libertarian point of view, the way I'm seeing the state is it is the territorial monopolist of taxation and law. Basically, the state has the authority to coerce us to pay taxes and to obey its laws. And we don't have that ability to push that obligation back onto the state. We can't say, we just don't have that same right. And so from our point of view, we see it as both a moral case, an ethical case, and also a pragmatic, practical case. We believe that the market is more efficient for the same reason that we don't want the government producing bread, is the same reason we don't want the government to have control over education, health, police, etc. And so that is at a high level where I'm coming from. And in terms of influences on my thought, it's various Austrian economists and people like Mises, Murray Rothbard, Hans-Hermann Hoppe, who are considered thought leaders in this world. And in the modern day tradition, obviously Hans-Hermann Hoppe is still alive, but some of the younger leaders in this space, people like Bob Murphy, Tom Woods, Jeff Deist, these are some other people who are currently pushing that forward or putting that idea out there, although I'm in that same I'm in that same school of thought.
Nice. So where do you see the role of technology in all of this? How do you think technology is going to impact which of these branches?
Sure. Yeah. So look, technology can be used to coerce and to compel, and it can be used to surveil, just as it is today. Like the leaks of Edward Snowden in 2012, that's now 10 years ago, they really showed the world that technology can be used to spy on people. It can be used to control people. And there have been all kinds of different things happening over that last decade that people can make arguments about, okay, how much is technology influencing things, even to the point of influencing elections and big tech? And is big tech arguably more powerful than at least some small nation states? Maybe not as powerful as the US government, but in certain cases, you could even make that argument that actually in certain ways, certain big tech platforms actually are more powerful than the US government, because they worry, let's say, that Zuckerberg might theoretically drive the algorithm against a particular politician, and in doing so tip the election in his own favor or against a certain politician if they do something to him, right? As an example, right? It's a bit of a hypothetical, obviously, but certainly there is that possibility. But also I see a possibility with Bitcoin and with other technologies that enable people to be self-sovereign. And I think that's partly what we do at Swan, is helping teach people, hey, this is how you can take control of your own coins and at least take back some of that wealth. And I think to that question you were asking about where and what is technology going to do to the relationship that we have with the states that essentially control and rule over us, I think it will change that relationship, because fundamentally people now have that option to be able to stack sats, stack some coin, and leave if they need to. And with Bitcoin, not sure how familiar everyone is with Bitcoin, but when you set up a Bitcoin wallet, for example, you can set it up on your phone easily with apps like Samurai Wallet or Blue Wallet or Phoenix Wallet, and they will typically give you 12 words, and you'll write that down, and theoretically you can use that to receive some coin, or you could buy some coin, and then you could walk across the border memorizing 12 words. So even if you had nothing on you and they could not, whereas historically, if you wanted to, like in an extreme scenario and you had to flee, you would have to try to smuggle the gold out of the country. Like, it's insane, right? Because ultimately you're having to trust somebody else. But with Bitcoin, you don't have to. So I think Bitcoin is the most important technology in this overall search for liberty. But there are other technologies as well. Things like being able to self-host your files and your documents, and being able to still communicate using encrypted communications, or VPNs as an example, or Tor, the onion router, being able to use these technologies and techniques to either give yourself some more privacy or be able to still access the internet or access things under more, let's say, adversarial conditions.
Yes, absolutely. So the way I see it, I think that the technology of money being decentralized is only the start of other technologies being decentralized. If you think about Charles Babbage came with the idea for a computer, at first he thought that this was going to be used to do logarithmic calculations. And then his protege, Ada Lovelace, looked at that and said, actually, this could be used for anything. It could be a universal machine, which then became a universal Turing machine when Alan Turing turned that into, a universal computer. So I think in a similar way, Bitcoin started out with decentralizing money. I'd love to hear your thoughts on things like Ethereum. Do you think, because for me, the way I see it, Bitcoin decentralized money, Ethereum is trying to decentralize everything. I think over time, I know it's very hard for people to imagine that sometimes now, but I think that that's where it's going. And if it's not Ethereum, it will be something else, but I feel like the same technology that's used to decentralize money can also decentralize power.
So I have to disagree a little bit. I don't really see that much of a point to Ethereum. Like, okay, yeah, for some people, yeah, maybe they can get rich off it, but I don't see it as really bringing about the same kind of sociological, broad economic change that Bitcoin is. Reason being, I see Ethereum as just creating this new system that's enriching like certain individuals in that ecosystem rather than actually creating a genuine new money. And so from my point of view, I just see Ethereum as it has various flaws and like just constant sort of band-aid on top of band-aid. That's what it seems like to me, right? I just see it like, why would people want to prepay their bank fee, as an example, right? Like if you want to have, I see it more like we're going to be moving into a world where it's going to be Bitcoin will be the money, but the services that you use may not necessarily be as quote unquote decentralized or on a blockchain. They may just be a company who's just using Bitcoin. And I don't see an issue with that. For me, the critique of Ethereum is partly that I think it is centralizing and it may continue to centralize. And I also think it ends up being a bit of a boondoggle, right? Like if you're seeing how high the fees are going, and they're sort of always continually trying to patch things up with a new patch, and then there's all this noise about going towards proof of stake, but then it keeps getting pushed back. And from my point of view, I don't see a lot of value in it for me. Like I understand other people find they have their own reasons for seeing value in it. I'm focused on getting the money right first, and fixing the money is important. And so then once we get that money right, then we can build other things on top of that. And they may not necessarily have to be on a blockchain. So from my point of view, the use of a blockchain is like this incredibly highly computationally costly thing. It's not an efficiency thing. It's very inefficient. Yes. But the reason we use it is because of the social scalability benefit that we get. And so I see it as that's what enables the system to operate in this decentralized way, but also in a robust and accessible way. And it's sort of like balancing across all of these things, right? Having a system that's really this decentralized, this robust, this accessible, and able to be cheaply validated, I think is very important.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, I have to disagree a little bit. I own Bitcoin. I respect what Bitcoin is doing. I think it's very valuable. However, I do think there is a value to decentralizing other things too. And I think it's only a technological issue that we are not able to do it yet. I think over time, as our technology grows, imagine once we have quantum computing, there's all of those inefficiencies can be solved. And the way I see it, I think that Ethereum, and it doesn't have to be Ethereum, maybe something else, like in a few years' time, maybe something completely different. Are you familiar with DAOs?
Yeah, so one of the first is actually the BISC DAO. So okay. BitSquare. So I think they were one of the first. Although people kind of debate exactly what is a DAO, how do you define it? But I have some familiarity, but not much with DAOs.
Well, the reason I talk about that is because DAOs, so much has come out of the Ethereum ecosystem. NFTs, DAOs, all of these things. I I see a lot of value in them when you start to actually experiment with them. Like I was not into NFTs at all, but once I started to really explore it and think about how you could build communities, how you could liberate, artists and create a lot of possibilities for them to, to build communities, I can see a lot of value in potentially in the direction that it's going. So I think definitely we could be living in a multi-chain world. I think that, actually, to be honest, I became interested in blockchain before I became interested in Bitcoin. So most people, learned about Bitcoin and they were like, okay, so what is this thing? The number is going up and it's creating a lot of money for people. So they got into it. Whereas for me, it was like, I read about blockchain and I was like, this is going to disrupt big tech. And, this is going to disrupt, Amazon and Apple and Google. And that's what was interesting for me, because I was like, we need to get away from whether it's a nation state or a corporate state. The problem is that authoritarianism that it can lead to. So I wonder if we lived in a world that there was no Ethereum or there was no other forms of use of blockchain, how could Bitcoin save us from the metaverse becoming the next authoritarian state?
Right. So I see it like modern nation states are able to fund their behavior through cheap debt. That means they put out government bonds. The bag holders around the world who have been tricked into thinking that these are a good investment or that they are, quote unquote, the safest, the risk-free rate of return. And they rely on this, and they rely on this whole philosophy, and they rely on it's a whole bunch of things, right? There's kind of the education propaganda aspect of, see, my nation state is the best versus yours is bad, and like there's kind of a bit of a nationalistic aspect there, and that also drives people to try to have allegiance to their state as opposed to their people. And like if you've ever heard people say that saying of, I love my country, but I hate my government. And so people, I think, should stop conflating the state with being good or democracy being good. It's not, in my view. It's so I understand that can be a bit sort of out there for people, because nowadays democracy is seen as like a good thing. People say, it's democratic. That makes it, people see it like a synonym for good. But I don't actually see it that way. I see it more like what's important is giving people the right property rights and justice. And so from my point of view, it's who is the correct owner of that property, who is the first person to mix their labor with that land or that property, or who created it. And then they should be given the property right. And property rights are only in physical things, not in intellectual things, because you can't own an idea, right? I can't own a tune or a number. Anyone could, say that or produce that. But the point is, people should be able to own that, and then they should be the determinant of what happens with that. So what I'm talking about is more like a private property order. However, from my perspective, the authoritarianism is coming in when the state does not respect that, because the state says, regardless of who owns that property, you owe me X, Y, and Z property tax, or I'm going to regulate your business, or I'm going to regulate your use of that property, Somi. So you may not do it in the way that you choose, because we, the community, have sort of chosen. And in the same way that, two wolves and a sheep vote on who's for dinner, that's not really just, right? Like, or another example from philosopher Michael Humer. He's also an anarcho-capitalist libertarian. He gives this example, right? He says, imagine you go for dinner with a group of 10 people. So there's 9 other people. And then at the end of the dinner, all of those 9 people vote for you to pick up the check. Is that a fair outcome? Well, I'll tell you what, it's definitely a democratic outcome, but it's not a just, like, and most people understand this. They say, well, hang on, I didn't agree to this. And so there's a bit of this kind of social contract theory argument. Now, some people agree with social contract theory. Many libertarians, especially the anarcho-capitalist libertarians, reject that theory. They say, no, we never signed up for this. You shouldn't have unchosen positive obligations to things. Your obligation to other people is to obviously not harm them and not take their stuff, broadly considered. So anyway, bringing it back to how do I see Bitcoin is going to change this? I see it as cheap credit and fiat money have enabled this vast expansion in the state in terms of their enforcement powers, their regulation powers. It just creates this massive bureaucracy that makes it more and more difficult for business and entrepreneurs and just people in general to make ends meet, because now they have to pay all these government taxes depending on where you are. That's property tax, income tax, sales tax, death taxes in some countries, you name it, and then obey all these regulations that are not necessarily fit for the market. They're just kind of like this government one size fits all, or this politician who wants to get popular managed to rile up the people, or in some cases it's delegated legislation that politician didn't even really have much say over. So there's all these examples where I see that the expansion of the state has been enabled by their cheap access to the money printer. And so I see it as central banks emerged and were this, they allowed the banking system to be cartelized. And then basically what happens is the large business owners and banks sort of ally with the state, and then they sort of pillage the population. And so from my perspective, I'm not anti-banking per se. I'm anti-central banking and I'm anti-fiat money. And I believe that if we were to move away from fiat money and move into a Bitcoin standard, the state would not be that powerful. And then like I've mentioned before, it's like this idea that even though I believe the ideal would, or at least bad solution would be anarcho-capitalism, I'll take whatever reduction in the size of the state I can get, generally speaking. If I can get reduction in taxes or reduction in regulation, well, then I think that's a good thing. And I think that's generally what people should be trying to do, because from my point of view, it's not like the market creates perfect outcomes. It's just that they're less bad than the state coming in with a one-size-fits-all rule that doesn't really fit and oftentimes makes things worse. So from my point of view, it's fixing the money stops the state expanding so much bigger than what it otherwise could, because instead of having to tax you explicitly, they can just do it by debt and push that cost not just to future you, but to your children and your children's children, and enable people to sort of live at the expense of the next few generations, or at least kind of increase their own living standard while hurting other people in the future, which is also unjust.
No, yeah, I definitely get where you're coming from. I guess I'm taking it a step further, because for me, I always think that the problem is most of the time thinkers, people who think about the next thing, then once they find that next thing and that next solution to move things better, they find some form of inertia and they don't want to move on from that. And I think that's maybe what's happening to Bitcoin maximalists, that, they're like, okay, this is a great idea. And then they want to park there. Whereas for me, I also call myself a transition architect. I lived all my life, I've been in transition, because I was born during the Iran-Iraq War. I'm very comfortable with this idea of transition. And I think that with the speed of technology, we need to be ready for constant transition. So the way I see it, I think that blockchain technology could potentially make it possible for us to move from representative democracy to direct democracy. And that's what DAOs are about. And I actually gave a TED talk about this. The next generation of democracy is being built on the next generation of the internet. Are you ready for it? So for me, that's the idea of Web3, and DAOs. That's what this is all about. So I hope to encourage you maybe to look into this a bit more, and I'd love to maybe have a follow-up conversation in 6 months' time or something, and see if you've had the chance to look into DAOs and think about, how do you see that? Because when I was listening to your conversation with Peter McCormack, I was thinking, I kept wanting to interject, and it was like, guys, DAOs, how about DAOs? Because you were talking about how the state police and all of these things could be organized through DAOs. And DAOs are not perfect. They're very, very new. They're in their infancy, but I can definitely see a potential there. Yeah.
So my off-the-cuff reaction to that idea is that I think ownership is being underrated a little bit here, because I think ownership is very important. And what happens in perhaps a DAO context is people can sort of palm it off and say, oh, it just happened. It wasn't my. Whereas if I'm an owner of whatever service, like if I own the road and it's my responsibility to make sure the customers get a safe road experience, or if I'm a butcher and it's my responsibility to give a good product, I think that ownership part is also really important, because then having the right incentive to deliver the right service is important. Now, that said, of course, I understand that there are, like, for example, with Bisq, there is a DAO and it's kind of done in a way where it's been set up in that way, I think partly because of government resistance, right? Having to resist the government has forced the creation of that kind of DAO because it has to operate in this way. But if we were to live under a world where you actually had a stronger sense of a property right to the things that you own, whether that's your business or your property, maybe a DAO wouldn't be so necessary. Maybe you could just own it and run it and operate it as a business owner, as a landowner, or as whatever.
But a person couldn't own the road. And actually in DAOs, you do have property rights because you have tokens. So, the members of the DAO, they will buy tokens, and then these tokens are used to align the incentives between the different stakeholders. So let's say you could say that there are certain things in human society that I'm passionate about. So I'm going to buy the kind of tokens that are going to be making a contribution to solving that problem for humanity. And the beauty of diversity is that we all have different experiences. So we all have different things that we care about, right? Like, for example, I really care about empowering women. I really care about, solving certain problems that maybe somebody else coming from a different place wouldn't. But if we all own tokens that enable us to vote, because those tokens, enable you to vote for certain actions to be taken, and then who is going to solve that problem. I think over time, like I say, DAOs are so new, but I definitely see that we are going towards a more decentralized society. If you think about going back all the way to the early history, we had in the beginning we had monarchy, kings and queens, and then around 12th to 16th century, we saw the rise of the elite and the artist and the scientist. And then from 17th century, we saw the 17th to 19th century, we started to see the separation of the church and the state. And then we went into 20th century, representative democracy. The way I see it, I think the next generation of democracy is more like direct democracy rather than representative democracy. So love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's important to recognize we already have equity, right? Like that ability to own a share in a company and vote on what happens. I mean, that already exists today. That's equity in a company, and that's the stock market. Now, we could argue that the current form of the stock market has been, let's say, abused or malformed into this by the fiat beast, right? It's been a downstream consequence of the fiat money is that, let's say, it's driven this crazy indexing approach as opposed to people actually taking ownership. So now we have the Black Rocks and Vanguards and State Streets of the world who just own everything. And then they're driving this kind of crazy policies from the very top. But in theory, I see it as companies, and owning a stock in a company is not really, like, I don't see DAOs as adding that much more relative to just having a company, except, as I said, in the case where the DAO needs to be able to be state resistant. And that's where I think, as an example, Bisq as a DAO makes sense, because they needed to be like a KYC free means of people trading Bitcoin for fiat. That's as an example. I think DAOs in other contexts may not make that much sense. I mean, hey, I'm open to being proven wrong, and I'm not saying they should not exist. I think people should be free to go and operate these things. I have no, I guess, moral or real practical opposition to them in other than the point I was just saying, which is just that it might not be that useful if you already have good property rights. Now you could say, hey, you know what? Actually, in a lot of the world, the Western government won't give you that property right, and maybe there's a point to be made there,
I guess what I'm trying to kind of conceptualize is, if you think about, instead of the government, if we had a big DAO, right? Like, how now we have got within the government, we've got like the Ministry of Transportation. instead of a Ministry of Transportation, you would have a sub-DAO, that would be about transportation. And then people could directly submit tickets of what is going wrong, and have a more direct say in the way that society is being run.
So from my point of view, that still boils down to, I think, direct democracy. And from my point of view, direct democracy is not really an improvement, because it ends up just being the same 9 people voting for the 10th guy to pay, or it just ends up, or it can end up just being resulting in abuses where, okay, so in democracy of today, you can get these kinds of issues where it's like known, and this is like a thing economists talk about, it's like this idea of distributed costs, but very concentrated benefits. And so if you can find scenarios like that, where it would be too costly to try to get all the individuals of society to agree on something, to vote against it, to stop this, then companies can sort of pay a little bit of money to get some lobbying happening and get some benefit, and get like a really big benefit, because that's worth millions of dollars to that company or billions to that company. And all the average everyday Joes and people out there on the street don't understand they're being robbed, but it's not worth their time, just like rationally, to go campaign in the streets for $10 each. But to that company, it's a lot of money. And so I think that's an example there. And I think fundamentally, if the DAO doesn't have strong property rights into the real world, then it can still get sort of shut down by governments, right? Because if a government says, no, well, we actually own that resource, you're not allowed to own it, we're regulating it, or get lost, like that's that, right?
Yes. Just changing the topic a little bit here. I have a theory that the governments are trying to slow down the speed of technological advancements. Just thinking about when I was listening to your conversation, latest one with Peter McCormack, you were talking about COVID and the overreaction. That you were of the opinion that there's that COVID was just a flu that's like a few times worse than normal flu, and this was an overreaction. I totally agree with that. But why do you think there was that overreaction? Do you think it was sheer incompetence, or do you think it was on purpose? Have you read The Sovereign Individual? I'm guessing you've read that. So they were talking about the possibility of a pandemic, around this kind of time, right? Like it's quite interesting the way it happened, and the way that all governments reacted in quite a similar way. Like my theory is that this is about slowing down technology.
It's hard to say. I don't have any well-developed theories on RC. It was this guy trying to pull the strings and slow it down. It's more just maybe there's like this confluence of different interests, right? That there's this industry of people who make a lot of money out of government-funded science, and they sort of tended to align on that side. And then the media and social media were sort of allying as the propaganda machine to scare people into, hey, stay at home, accept all these crazy impositions into your life that it would never have been allowed or even thought of 20 or 30 years ago. That would never have gone. It would have never flown. And on the other hand, you could also say, look, the fact that people could do Zoom work might have also helped enable it too, right? Like imagine if we didn't have like Zoom and Skype and things, they might not have seen it. There might not have been enough of a population who could be made to go along with it. Because the way I'm seeing it is there was enough of a population who could go along with it that they did foolishly. It was obviously a stupid error, but there was enough people who either work for the government, have safe jobs, not going to lose their jobs, welfare state recipients, and people in the so-called Zoom class, right? The people who can work from home on their laptops. There weren't enough people in that brick and mortar category, or people who really who actually need to go out. And so I think when you sum that up, and alongside the people who are sort of more ideologically aligned with this idea of lowering your consumption and so on, then, and just I think a lot of hysterical people and maybe people who just were not able to think clearly, and this culture of you're not allowed to speak out, because if you do, we're going to cancel you. And any doctors were being shut down. They were being having their licenses taken away, or people tweeting out things were just getting their accounts shut down. Like it was a confluence of all these different factors, I think, that led to what we saw with all the lockdowns and the travel bans and everything, right? So it's hard to say that it was like a specific conspiracy of this person and so on. I mean, for all we know, I don't know, but I think a lot of it comes down to just incompetence and a confluence of interests that just happened to point in that same way. And there were enough people who thought or believed that or had an incentive to think that way, right? And especially if you had an internet business right now some of them are tanking, but at the start of the scam, basically in 2020, the FANG stocks were just running like crazy, like Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, etc., Google, Apple. They were all just going insane because everyone was sitting at home on the computer. So they were making a lot of money. Like it's not that everyone suffered, it's that certain businesses suffered at the expense of others who did really, really well. And obviously, I think that was unjust because it broke all kinds of protections and rights that people thought they had, right? They didn't believe that someone else, some idiot politician or bureaucrat, thousands of kilometers away could just shut down your life, destroy your job, stop you seeing your family, and just, without regard for your rights and your choice in the matter.
Yeah, definitely. So, what are your thoughts on the metaverse? Because this was also mentioned in the Sovereign Individual. It seems like basically everything they said has happened. The only thing that they didn't quite think about was the rise of China, which is something that Peter Thiel mentions in the foreword of the latest edition. But yeah. So where do you see Bitcoin fitting in this? What are your feelings about the metaverse? The fact that we are going to be spending so much time in the metaverse, and like we are already in a kind of a metaverse, but probably more immersive. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't have any well-developed thoughts on it. I do see a little bit of, I think my initial reaction is a bit anti this, right? Because it's kind of, you see what the people like the World Economic Forum or, these people are trying to push us into this kind of stay on your pod, eat the bugs, just, play this VR game and we'll placate you and we'll just send you checks and don't worry. Like, part of me is sort of like pushing back on that and thinking, no, like I don't want that. I understand maybe in a more, what's the word, benign sense, there are people that, who play games, right? Like, I mean, most of us grew up playing computer games as a kid, right? So we were playing computer games and whatever. So in that sense, I mean, is that a metaverse? Maybe. I mean, if you're just playing like a game and maybe the games are getting more advanced, but it's important to remember that's a game. Like, that is not meant to be real life, and real life is meant to be interacting with people and, achieving things and doing things.
Very interesting. So there are a few things that I'm really hoping to have you back on the podcast and discuss. So DAOs, the metaverse, and maybe NFTs even. I'm guessing that you are against them as well.
I'd say they're kind of orthogonal for me. Like, I just don't really see any point. Like, if I had to steal, like, to be fair, to steel man the NFT, right? Even though I've never touched NFTs, I've never done anything with them. If I had to steel man it, I'd see it like it's kind of like a Patreon for people you like, right? Like, if it's a singer you like or an actor or whatever that you like and you buy their NFT, it's kind of like you're just patronizing them, right? Maybe that's kind of the way I see that. But I also see it like, hey, it's a big, like we saw it was like a bit of a bubble, right? Like Jack Dorsey did an NFT of his first tweet and it went for millions, and then someone tried to sell it again, but then like the best bid on it was like $300 or something ridiculous. So I think it's like the bottom has fallen out of the NFT market, and now reality is coming back.
I think there's a little bit more nuance to it, so maybe that's another. So let's have a follow-up call in about 6 months to a year. Okay. And I think that, just have these things on your radar, and then, we can have a follow-up conversation. And I would love to hear how your thoughts develop, throughout this time, because from my observation is that these things are becoming more and more part of the public psyche. And I would say that, there's really some really important things happening in the way that we are as humans. I think we are becoming more integrated into technology, into digital technologies, and I think this century is the century that we are going to pretty much fully integrate and merge with technology. Maybe one last question would be, have you read The Singularity is Near?
Who's that by?
Ray Kurzweil.
Yes, actually, I think I have. I read this book called The Singular. I think it was called The Singularity by Ray Kurzweil. Maybe it's called The Singularity is
The
Near.
Singularity is Near.
Yeah, I remember reading that
many
a
years
while
ago.
Maybe 2009 or 10, around there, maybe 11. Around there was when I read it. Yes. I think it might have been out for 3 or 4 years before I had read it. I found it really fascinating at the time. Mm-hmm. But I think maybe overly bullish on timelines, I think.
So he's got a follow-up book coming up, and I'm really hoping to get him on a podcast. He's got a follow-up book coming up in 2023. I've already pre-ordered it. It's called The Singularity is Nearer. So I think the combination of the singularity is near and the sovereign individual, and I really want to see what he's thinking about in terms of the singularity is nearer. I think that blockchain technology is going to get disrupted, so I'm looking at the next disruption, which I believe potentially is going to be with quantum computing. So that's what I'm already studying. And like I said, for me, blockchain technology was so much more interesting than Bitcoin per se. I think that the technology itself is got so much potential, but technology is moving so fast. So that the theme in everything that I personally look at is the exponentiality, how exponentially things are changing.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I see it like blockchain technology is not actually that interesting to me. It's actually Bitcoin is the innovation. But I appreciate the conversation, and I'm happy to chat again.
Amazing. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Stephan Livera. Be sure to check out his excellent podcast and listen to his other interviews too, and follow him on Twitter. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it on Apple, Spotify, or any other one of your favorite podcast channels. And don't forget to give it a 5-star rating and write a review. The full reviews are also available on my YouTube channel.